Hello, everybody. I'm so excited for this session because we have a wonderful speaker, and I heard that we have also a very versatile crowd to take part in today's lecture. And let me briefly introduce myself. I'm a PhD student at the UCL at the University College London, and I'm on a populism project, and my particular interests are in the economic aspects of populism. Which is great because one of the readings today actually deals with this. And I'm also very much concerned with whether Central Eastern Europe has some different nature of populist parties and populist voters. And I'm Paulina, by the way, I should have started with that. But let me introduce you to a wonderful speaker that we have today for our lecture. I'm quite excited to introduce you to Dr. Tsveta Petrova, and she is a lecturer in the political science at Columbia University. She received her PhD from Cornell University, and she held a number of very prestigious positions, including a postdoc at Harvard. So her research currently focuses on democracy, democratization, democratic promotion. She is expert in, she published in major, very peer-reviewed journals, including Cambridge University Press in 2014. A list of her articles appeared in peer-reviewed journals as Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Democracy, Journal of Government and Opposition, Europe-Asia Studies, East European Politics and Societies, and now Cultures, and so on and so forth. So I'm quite excited to introduce you to Dr. Petrova, who's be speaking today about populism, democracy, and authoritarianism, and she'll also lead some group exercises for today. So the lineup, just before I give the floor, is we'll have a lecture for 60 minutes from Dr. Petrova, which I'm really looking forward to. Then we'll have a quick break, depending on our needs, up to 15 minutes. And then we have 45 minutes of, I hope, very vivid discussion. And I'm here as your chair trying to, facilitate the Zoom remoteness. And I hope we have a really great time for brainstorming about populism. So without further ado, I let the floor to Dr. Petrova.
Thank you, Paulina. And thank you for the Center for Study of Populism. I'm really excited to be here with you today and to have this opportunity to discuss with you how populism relates to democracy and authoritarianism with a view coming from Central and Eastern Europe. Okay, so again, as I said at the onset of this presentation, what I wanted to discuss with you today is the relationship of populism to democracy and authoritarianism. Populism as an ideology and its impact on the regime type of various countries, with my focus being Central and Eastern Europe. In terms of agenda, what I'm hoping to do today, and what I hope you will get out of this presentation, is an overview of the literature on global populism, especially as it relates to the relationship between voters and parties, me being a political scientist myself. And then I want to take this broader literature and discuss it with an eye of the historical and political developments in Central and Eastern Europe, the way that literature gets contextualized and then informs the literature, the broader literature on global populism. And so I will spend most of the time specifically discussing Eastern Europe. And there's two sides of this story that I would like to tell. On the one hand, it's the side of parties, the perspective of party development, party system transformation, and how it is that certain parties become populist or how populist parties emerge. How is it that they tailor their agenda to voters in a populist way? That's on the supply side. I'll spend some time here, and I hope you will take away this difference between economic and cultural proposals and party platforms, as well as the relationship between civic mobilization or mobilization at the level of society through various social movement networks, NGOs, civic and grassroots groups, as well as political mobilization or the mobilization of voters through parties and around elections and other various voting events. The other side of the story that I'd like to tell today is that of voters, or why voters, particular sets and groups or individual voters choose to support populist parties. And here I want almost in parallel you to pay attention to the economic, the cultural, and the security drivers of voter support, as well as how the authoritarian or democratic values and beliefs of individual voters inform their behavior at election times. Okay, so with that in mind, of course, the first thing that we need to do is define populism so that we are all speaking about the same phenomenon. I know that you've already had 2 presentations and they've touched on this topic. So I want to quickly ask you, what is your definition of populism? Very quickly. I want to hear from at least 3 people to bring out some of the definitions that have already come up and that you have found compelling. And then I would like to share my own so that you understand what I mean by populism for the rest of the presentation. So would anyone like to share, or shall I call on people? Oh, I see, I think Daniel, I saw raise his hand.
Yeah, that's correct. Well, after the lectures, I have a broader picture, and I can see that I can define populism by the ideology, by the strategy and discursive, but I would also see as a reasoning, I think it's something that questions the institutional, the democratic institutions, something that divide the population between we, the people, or a group. It can be either an economic identification or ethnic identification, and there is always an antagonist, and it happened to be the one in power. In other words, the elite. Maybe it is a political elite, or it's always privilege, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I also, as a result of the lectures and the readings, I also see populism as something that is highly dysfunctional, and it tends to break with the status quo that there is in the liberal democracy. Yeah, that's what I can understand after this lecture.
Great.
The last thing is something, as I understood also, that it's very try to accommodate to the several currents. So, for example, in the readings that I've checked, when there was neoliberalism, in order to be under the influence of Europe, some parties in Central European, they became more pro-Europe, so to speak.
Yeah, and we'll touch on that. Yep.
So it's a bit like that, in my understanding.
Fantastic. This was a really good overview. Let me hear from another one of you. What did you take away from the discussions about what populism is?
If I may, I can share my view on that as well.
Please.
For me, I think populism is a force once used to unite the people or the masses to struggle against the dictators and tyrannies. But now in the 21st century, we see again it is a force, but this time it is damaging to harm the democratic institution, to divide the people, to create, to construct the people, I think, in an antagonistic way.
Okay. Okay, so I can see some common themes. The first one, which is very much spot on and which I want to reiterate for you today, is that we can think about populism as 3 different things: an ideology, a rhetoric or discourse, or narrative within policies, as one of you expressed interest, and finally as a mode of organization. So it could be a mode of organization, as Mustafa just rightly pointed out. It could be a way of relating between the masses, voters, a certain social segment or a block of social groups, and a party, a leader, a government. That's the way of organizing. It could be mediated or unmediated, and populism tends to be, populists tend to argue for an unmediated relationship. It could be a rhetoric that touches on some of these themes about who we are, we as we the people, we as we the nation, we as an ethnic or economic group, as Daniel reminded us, or it could also be an ideology. And I look at populism, I think about populism, I work on populism as an ideology. And as an ideology, it has to me three distinctive characteristics. It is anti-establishment, it is monist and moralist. Let me explain those in turn. Anti-establishment is just as the discussion we had. It's a way of seeing, parsing the polity into two groups, elites and the people, right? It's this opposition. It's, as I think Mustafa talked about, it's anti-status quo, or antagonistic versus those in power. And those in power don't necessarily have to be only those in political power. Oftentimes we see this anti-elitist way of thinking that is applied to the political, but also the economic, media, social relations, and so on and so forth. So it's this cleavage between elites and the people. And this cleavage is also a moralist one, right? Because it's not just a distinction between elites and people, but these are morally qualified. We usually think, or populists argue, that the elite is corrupt, whereas the people are good, they're pure, they know what's best for the nation and for themselves. And this moralist tone, again, is particularly important. And it's also important combined with the third element, which is the monist way of thinking about both elites and the people. And what I mean by that is that these groups are seen to be homogeneous, right? All of the elites are the same, they're corrupt. All of the people are the same and are pure, they're good. They tend to have the best interest of the nation in mind. And so as a result of this moralist and monist way of thinking about the world, populists oftentimes would claim that they themselves are the only true representatives of the good people. And so what you have is that populism can be inherently anti-pluralist. It can have a view of the polity that denies the existence of different groups with different interests, different beliefs, different preferences for policy, right? You see this opposition of elites, good people, but good people being the same. And it's this anti-pluralism that has an interesting relationship to democracy and authoritarianism that I hope will tease out through the rest of this presentation. But again, when we talk about populist, I would like you to think about anti-establishment, monist and moralist ideology that again could be combined with other ideologies on the left or on the right. And in the Central European context, oftentimes it's on the right that we see these populist parties emerge and especially be successful. Okay. So moving on, how can we think about the rise of populism, right? There's been a distinctively important wave of populist movements that have emerged, that have become more prominent. Some of these movements are organized around parties that have done increasingly well in elections, and in certain countries, as in Central and Eastern Europe, they've even come to power. So how can we think about this rise of populism? Why is it that more and more people participate in those movements? But especially as a political scientist, I'm interested in why is it that voters support populist parties and bring them to power? And as I said, political scientists sometimes think in economic terms, and they oftentimes want to convince us that the relationship between parties and voters is almost like a marketplace where you have the supply side, or these are the parties that put forward particular ideologies and proposals, policy proposals. And then you also have voters who are purchasing or who are convinced by some of these platforms or not. And so it's the negotiation between parties and voters where supply and demand meets to bring to electoral success. So with that in mind, let me continue walk you through those without necessarily implying that the way I see the relationship between parties and voters is really like a marketplace. It's more a label that we political scientists use. So thinking about parties and what parties might do, there have been a number of studies that look at how the electoral system of certain countries is set up. And so the first thing they do is they look at the rules for conducting elections and for parties winning power. And there's been a debate whether the type of electoral system matters and help particular populists become more successful. So we've seen arguments such as that proportional systems with lower thresholds have a positive effect on populist parties, right? Proportional is such that the number of votes is directly relevant to the number of seats that a party would receive. And so if we have such a system and there's no threshold, like a party needing 5% of the vote to make it to parliament, this has allowed populists to gain representation in national bodies. Others have argued that, in fact, it's not proportional, but it's disproportional voting systems that may incentivize voters to around particular protest parties, right? So if you want change, even though you might not like the populists and what they propose, because you want change, you're making a strategic voice to bring a party, an actor into the political system that would upset the status quo. And it's exactly where it's disproportional, like winner take all or mixed PR and winner take all systems, that you see the strategic voting that has propelled populist parties forward. And finally, we have others who say, well, it's mixed electoral systems that might incentivize strategic voters in such a way that they actually disincentivize third parties, like populists that might be newcomers into the systems. So there's still quite a lot of debate, but I think the important point to take away here is that the electoral rules matter, and we need to understand them and pay attention to them in the countries that you study. A second and perhaps more prominent line of conversation, of academic conversation, is on the actual positions of parties. And here there is perhaps the most widespread explanation of the rise of populism has been that of the convergence of the mainstream parties. What do we mean by that? You must have heard about the so-called third wave, when after the rightist revolution under Reagan and Thatcher, a lot of the left parties responded to that by moving closer to the center, especially on economic issues, and arguing that they accept globalization and market forces, that those could help workers, they could help bring wealth, they could trickle down some of the wealth to the middle and working classes, and that way advance the interests of those groups. So the left distinctively moved, if you imagine the spectrum from left and right, from a more radical to a more centrist position, bringing it closer to the right. And so this is often talked about as convergence of mainstream parties around generally neoliberal economic policies. And because of this convergence, some have argued that, well, that has opened up a space that created a niche for populist parties with a different proposal, with a different economic proposal to emerge and to be successful. And that's an economic proposal that is argued to protect the working and middle classes against market forces. We'll talk about this a bit more in the Eastern European context, but you've seen some of the readings for today discuss that, especially the Snegovaya and Sherry Berman reading, as well as the Mitchell-Orenstein reading. Okay, so these are the two big debates that I'd like you to pay attention to on the supply side. Let's turn to the demand side. And this is the question of, well, parties might offer certain policy proposals, but oftentimes they do so in response to the demand of voters, or they still need to have those policies resonate with voters. So what it is that voters want. And here I see the literature is divided basically in three groups of arguments. And these three groups of arguments cover different types of insecurities. The first one is ontological, the second one is economic, and the third one is cultural insecurities. What do I mean by those? There are some, especially in the literature on American populism, that have argued that there's certain individuals that have a personal psychological predisposition towards authoritarian values, beliefs, an authoritarian mindset. And that is mainly understood as a preference for social order and hierarchy. And the early tests of this mindset of these authoritarians was by 4 simple questions about child rearing and whether there should be a strict hierarchy within the family, with orders flowing down from the parents to the children and rule following. But you can see how that can generally be extracted about preferences about social order. Customs and belief in tradition, rule following, strong leadership, and a hierarchy of social groups within the polity. And so there have been arguments that there is a segment of the population that hold these that hold this authoritarian mindset that could be activated at certain elections if presented with a compelling narrative about a threat, a social or even physical security threat to themselves, to their group, to the polity. And so it's these activated authoritarians that become the supporters of populists. That's what I refer to as ontological insecurity. The second group of explanations focuses on economic insecurity. And here we're back to the conversation about, in a way, the convergence of mainstream parties. And the argument is that we've seen broad structural changes in the global and national economies around the world. And in those changes, these changes have been the result of the speeding up of globalization, of automation, and the advent of sort of the AI industrial, the AI economic revolution. And all of those have had the effect of rising inequality, stagnating wages, poor job contracts and working conditions for workers, that as a result of these changes of automation and globalization, there are many usually in the working and middle classes that are left behind, right? That the wealth has accumulated in countries, but disproportionately so. And it is those who feel left behind or who are objectively left behind, who have experienced poor working conditions, job losses, stagnating wages, or who see their country or their social group as being one of the losers of globalization, who might vote for populists. This is what I will refer to as economic insecurity. And finally, there is a third kind of argument, which is that this speeding up of globalization has been not only economic, but also cultural. That's paired with the broader shift on a global scale towards more postmodern, post-materialist, socially progressive values. An acceptance of multiculturalism, political liberalism as primarily as democracy, as rights and liberties for minorities, gender, sexual minorities, but also environmental movements, movements that call for more transparency and participatory political organization. So it's these socially progressive values that have made progress and have been more broadly accepted worldwide. And there are some groups who hold beliefs that are antithetical to these progressive values that are pushing back, that are looking to organize and to reverse this social change towards a more revisionist set of social values, more conservative, even religious social values. So this is what we might refer to as cultural insecurity that could be a driver for support for populists. Okay, so with this broad debate in mind, I want now to focus on Central and Eastern Europe and see how some of these themes, some of these conversations play out in a very specific region. Now, because there isn't that many of you who work on the region, let me just pause and give you a very quick political history. And again, if you have any questions or clarifications, I would like you to stop me because I think that this discussion is important background for you to understand what will come next. So if at this segment of the presentation you have questions, please either speak up with your voice or raise your hand digitally so I can call on you. Now, when we talk about Eastern Europe, we generally refer to the region that was part of the communist bloc after the Second World War. So that are broadly the countries of the former Soviet Union, the allied countries of the Soviet bloc, as well as some of the communist countries in former Yugoslavia. These are the Eastern European countries that have been transformed by this legacy of communism. And some think about, and we can think about communism as a system that operates on three levels. Communism was first and foremost a system of economic organization where the state controlled and owned the economy and directed all economic activity. But it was also a political system where the Communist Party ruled the communist state and directed the economy, directed and managed the economy, planned and executed the economy. And it was a communist party that, it was a system that was politically repressive and authoritarian because of the limited opportunities for truthful representation of popular preferences and forms of self-governance. And then finally, because of the competition of the Soviet Union and Western democracies and the Iron Curtain that existed around the communist bloc and the allied systems, communism was also an international system of relationships within the communist world in Eastern Europe and beyond to the developing world, but also as an isolated system of competition with Western democracies. And so it's these three levels of communism that we want to keep in mind and to understand when we think about the really transformative changes that happened at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. When some of the countries in the Soviet bloc, starting with Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, managed to overthrow communism, which led to the disintegration of the Soviet bloc first, eventually also to the collapse of the Soviet Union and former Yugoslavia. And so by the early 90s, all of these countries have, in one way or another, rejected communism and have declared their intention to move toward market democracy. They have, the Iron Curtain has fallen, right? The system has opened up. So these countries are now part of this broader system and are very exposed to the forces of globalization. And there are also countries that are implementing various reforms domestically, usually to allow, to open up the space for political competition, allow not just the Communist Party, but other parties to compete while the Communist Party is itself transforming. Some of these communist parties are becoming extinct, some continue to exist, other ones have so-called successors which take over some of the ideology, the cadres and the organization. But then also new parties emerge, some of which are based in the opposition movements to communism, but others are not. So you really have this very dynamic political system in which there's a lot of competition, and that competition is regulated in different ways. These systems are fair in different ways or not fair in different ways. They all declare to be moving towards democracy, but there are still a lot of reforms and problems with democracy. You also have, hand in hand with the collapse of communism, new ways of managing the economy. And here too, you have a number of reforms that try and open up ownership of the economy, not just to state, but to new private actors. And you have new ways of regulating that economic activity, in part, not only to manage these new ways of ownership, but also to relate to the outside world, because again, there's no isolation. And these economies are becoming quickly, very quickly, open to different degrees. Okay. So in this context, some of the literature on the region in the early 1990s was really sounding off alarm bells and saying, look at these societies that are undergoing really challenging transformations, quite unprecedented in their scale. Because even though these countries were part of a wave of democratization that started in Latin America, went to Central and Eastern Europe, then we see it expands to the Middle East, to Asia, to Africa. None of these other countries are also undergoing market reforms with democracy and then inclusion in the international system. And then remember that for parts of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, you also have ethnic wars and contestation of who's part of the state and the nation and who is not. So it's really quite unique laboratory of demanding transformations and reforms. And political scientists are saying the population is going to reject some of these reforms. These reforms are going to be painful. And what you will see is a populist backlash where you will see the emergence of elites that want to protect the population, defined in a specific way, and I'm using air quotes to sort of signal some of the language that was used at the time that is not necessarily as how we might think about this language today. But we might see the population just pushing back against reforms and democracy in particular. And yet, interestingly, we come to the late 1990s and we have not seen this populist or demagoguery pushback. And then we see the literature take a step back and start to rethink about why is it that voters might be supporting these really difficult reforms? And why is it that parties aren't offering nationalist proposals that are of the populist variety? And something of a consensus emerges that, again, what is unique about Eastern Europe is that this fall of communism is accompanied with a nationalist project, which is forward-looking and which is a project of reintegration into the Euro-Atlantic space. And so for many of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, this is a transformation of rejoining Europe, being part of the EU, and as a result, sharing the economic and political values that Western European, even American countries have. This is seen, this is manifested in these countries applying for membership in the European Union and NATO. Or at least forming close relationships, seeing those international organizations and their members as models of political and economic organization of a modern, successful state. And so it's this convergence of values, of this historical convergence on political models that is used to explain why there's been no populist backlash. And this also brings about a degree of optimism about, look, we can see the successful transformation towards democracy and market in this context, and that's really fantastic. And yet, as this process progresses, especially in the early 2000s, the literature on the regimes, on the political regimes in Eastern Europe begins to, again, you see some new kinds of warnings. And these warnings are not so much about a backlash, like a populist backlash of let's do away with this new political system, as we would see in the early 1990s, but instead it's about, well, they're all moving towards democracy, but really it's not a real democracy. It's a new democracy. It's a hybrid democracy. It's an illiberal democracy. Various authors begin to wonder, to question the commitment of elites to democracy and the commitment of citizens to democracy. And they wonder, well, what will happen once those countries are members of the EU and NATO, and these organizations no longer have leverage and to insist that these countries implement certain liberal economic and political reforms? What would happen then? Would democracy fall apart? And this is when we get to the mid-2000s, when for the first time in 2005 in Poland, we see a populist party come to power. Now, what's interesting about that is that this party is in power just for 2 years, and that it's part of a somewhat weak and fragmented coalition. And it's the disagreement between the parties in the coalition that eventually brings it down from power in 2007. And they don't really have that much time or opportunity to implement far-reaching reforms, but you begin to see a very well-pronounced populist policy stance, especially in the political, even though it's unimplemented. In the economic one as well, it starts as still more in line with new liberal economic policies and prescriptions, but it has a very strongly nationalist and protectionist flavor to it. And so even though Law and Justice, that's the party in Poland that comes to power in 2005, doesn't manage to implement some of its vision, we see that a party like that can be successful. And again, that begins to worry political scientists who say, oh, we are entering this post-accession period where we might see radical transformation that have to do with democratic erosion and that are on the back of nationalist mobilization. Okay, let me pause here and just see any questions, comments, or concerns. Okay, so I will quickly move forward then. Moving forward from 2005 and the post-accession years to 2010, we see in Hungary the coming of power of a party, the Fidesz party led by Viktor Orban, who is perhaps now the face of Eastern European populism in the eyes of the West and many in the region. And what's interesting about him is that he comes to power in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, the global financial crisis, with a set of unorthodox policies, right? He goes back, he proposes to reject some of the reforms that the IMF and the EU have suggested. And what he offers instead is sort of a very statist, nationalist, developmentally, economic policies that pit Hungary and true Hungarians versus the forces of foreign economic domination. Basically, those forces that have come to Hungary, have bought out Hungarian assets, and are now dictating economic policy. And he implements that with an eye of helping the masses that are hurt by this turn of political and economic history in Hungary. He effectively nationalizes banks, energy companies, and he has handouts for the population, broadly for the masses as a result in the process. He promotes a national Hungarian class, business class, that is close to the party, and begins to slowly but steadily concentrate power in the government by dismantling checks and balances, but also by really restricting opposition both politically and civically in Hungary. And you see this model that evolves slowly over time, sometimes through trial and error, that is a model that's a recipe for populism in the region. Okay, so now let's talk about how the literature has explained the rise of this populism in the region, with Hungary sort of being the first full embodiment. But we see other parties. Law and Justice returns to power in 2015, and we see other parties on the right propose similar measures throughout the region. Okay, the literature on Eastern Europe focuses primarily on supply side explanations. And so here, there is a really good relationship between the literature in Eastern Europe and the literature on global populism, because we see this argument of, in Eastern Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, because of these post-communist transition changes, there are weak partisan identities. Voters don't have a strong attachment to a particular party, so it's very easy for them to shift their vote or even to accept and continue voting for a party that has shifted its own positions. And there's a similar line of argument more broadly, where some have argued that with sort of the advent of service economies, these ties between social groups and parties are no longer as meaningful. That, for example, workers who used to vote for the left, to be organized through unions and support the left, well, there aren't that many workers now that could do that. That instead we have these postmodern, post-material changes, and so the relationship between parties and voters is much more individualized, and therefore it's much weaker. But in the post-communist context, that's especially a problem because of the newness of the parties and their relationship with voters. And because of that, because of this specific context, what is especially problematic to many is a failure of the left, right? So imagine these parties that used to be communist parties that have now reformed to support workers, just like the Communist Party did once upon a time. But now these parties support workers in the context of a open democracy, open market democracy. And these parties, instead of supporting the workers, they have embraced market reforms that should have been, that are against the interests of these workers, because these workers, they lose their jobs, they get less pay, their life becomes harder and harder through these transition years in the economic reforms. Yet instead the left, in part to legitimate itself, is now supporting these economic reforms. And so the workers are left unrepresented. Their true economic interests are left unrepresented. There's also a cultural variant of this argument about the failures of the left parties. And this argument is that these left parties, again, in part to legitimate themselves as not communist, as deserving to exist in a post-communist context, that these parties have formed alliances with liberals abroad, liberals in the EU, that these parties have accepted cultural values and have subjugated themselves to the dictate of international organizations and foreign countries. And so it's this cultural copying that is particularly objectionable to some nationalist voters and parties. And so with the EU accession of the Eastern European countries, when their governments no longer have to do everything that the EU says, there is a niche. There's a niche for nationalist parties that push against Brussels, that push against big governments in Germany, in France, to assert the interests of Central and Eastern European countries. And so again, think back to Hungary and Orban, who in the middle of a crisis is pushing against what the EU recommends, what Germany wants the EU to implement as sound economic crisis management in the wake of the 2008 crisis, right? So in other words, the literature in Eastern Europe is arguing that either the left has failed to represent voters, which has opened up a niche for parties that look to propose protection of working middle classes, basically the poor, and that left, but even more broadly, all of the parties, by agreeing on the necessity of EU accession, they have created a space for nationalist parties who push against the internationalization of their countries, who push against the foreign liberal influence to be successful. Okay. I wanted to quickly sketch out this, the economic argument, which you see in the Snegovaya reading, and to present some of the evidence, just so you get a flavor of how political scientists make those arguments. So you might see that, for example, Snegovaya and Borman argued that with left parties shifting to the center in economic policies, especially around austerity reform implementation, their traditional constituencies in the face of the lower middle class or workers are abandoned by those parties. And so it's then that we have some right parties, or whether radical or mainstream, that adopt redistribution platforms targeting specifically the former constituencies of the left parties, which makes them electorally successful. And here on the left-hand side, you will see that the increase in the voter share of the far-right Jobbik party in Hungary tracks very parallel with the shift in blue-collar vote to Jobbik parties, right? So you might think about policy proposals and then how votes shift as a result of that to understand how economic policy or cultural policy might bring about the electoral success of populism. There is a second line of argument which looks at not just the policy offerings and the votes as a result of that, but who think about the organization of parties. And here you have the Bela Greshkovits reading that I assigned to you, which looks at the civic embeddedness of the Hungarian right. What's interesting about this line of research that I find fascinating and frankly quite rare in the literature in Eastern Europe is that oftentimes populism is thought as this direct linkage between a leader like Viktor Orban and voters who are captivated by the leader's charisma and appeals. And so it's almost like that's all you need for a party to be successful. But instead, some of the scholars on the literature have pointed out that no, actually, this relationship between the leader and the electorate is mediated by a really dense and massive civic network. And the study that Bela does starts all the way back in 2002 when Orban is voted out of office. And at that prospect, he goes to his electorate and gives a very famous speech in 2002 in which he calls for the establishment of the so-called civic circles. He's basically arguing that the nation, which is what he represents, cannot be in opposition. And so he calls on people to set up these organizations that will educate their members, but also mobilize them to take action and begin rehearsing voting in various referenda to put together an electoral bloc. And what you see in the article that I assigned is just how successful the right is in organizing, in creating this dense civic network and then using it to protest, but also to re-educate Hungarians about what it really means to be Hungarian, what the nation is. And again, I say the nation with quotes because it's their definition of nation, which is very exclusionary. It excludes certain groups. But it's the way that the party and the movement talks about itself. So there have been others who, again, are paying attention to the relationship between parties and civil society and voters and just how interconnected those are, and therefore how resilient and powerful these movements are, how it's not a fluke, how it's not a party that can just be voted out at the next election because it has this organizational basis and its own ideology that has managed to put together this unique electoral bloc that is a bloc of primarily educated, middle-class, socially conservative Christian individuals. But especially in the later years, they recognize that they need the electoral support of the poor, even Roma, who are oftentimes excluded from the definition of nation. But even they're brought into the movement to support the rise and the resilience in power of the Fidesz movement. So it's another line of research that I want you to keep in mind and to be aware in thinking about this supply side of populism in Eastern Europe. And then finally, what's also interesting about the region is, and here we get to its distinctiveness, I'll go through it quickly, primarily to give you a flavor of other similar types of arguments that you might find in the countries that you study. But here we have some who pay attention to the legacies of communists. communism, as well as the legacies of interwar fascism. And so, for example, you'll see arguments such as an argument that communism really left a big imprint on voters in Eastern Europe because there's expectation of egalitarianism and social, apologize, as a state patronage and protectionism, that the state should act as a caretaker of the people, that most people, that there shouldn't be extreme inequality, wealth inequality. That these are attitudes that neither voters nor parties have been able to shake, right? And because of that, parties will inevitably come back to policies of redistribution. And then some would also look at differences between varieties of communism, national accommodative communism, like in Hungary and Poland, which have cushioned some of the losers of the reforms with generous welfare states, versus bureaucratic authoritarian or patrimonial communism, and sort of look at the generosity of the resultant welfare state and how that relates to the success of populism. Then there are others who look at the interwar period and say, well, between the two world wars, fascism, understood as a nationalist socialist ideology, was really widespread and popular in the region. And even though the region was transformed by half a century of communism, there are these authoritarian values that are so deeply embedded in the culture and the party system that they were activated, that they could quickly and easily be activated. And oftentimes you even see some of these parties borrow from the insignia, the imagery, the symbolism of interwar fascism, perhaps with less of the violence openly advertised, but nonetheless, a lot of the symbolism that is available for these parties to use. So you see some of these arguments show up, as well as, like I said, broader arguments about the failure of the left, the cultural subjugation of Eastern Europe, and austerity policies that generally decrease support for incumbents and boost support for populists as those who upset the status quo. And all of these processes being accelerated by weaker partisan identities that allows voters to switch between parties, or for parties to switch their programs fairly easily, with, again, populist parties being understood as not just politically successful, but socially embedded organizations. Okay. That's the supply side. The demand side, or there are some, though fewer, studies on why voters support populist parties. And here we come back really to the three types of insecurities that we talked about in the literature on global populism. And in the Eastern European context, they take a very concrete, they have a very concrete historical construction, which is around the post-communist transition process. So, for example, there are some who argue that the region has gone through 2 decades of really unprecedented reforms that have created a sense of insecurity and chaos, and that many voters are tired and they yearn for strong leadership, for strict rule following and social order. And it's those individuals that are easily mobilized by populists. And that's especially the case in the mid-2010s, as we see the migrant crisis in Europe, where on top of all of that, the Eastern European countries experience a wave of socio-demographic change that they have not before, with the influx, or the feared influx of Muslim and broader non-European migrants. There's a different type of argument, which is closer to the economic insecurity argument, which looks at not the losers of globalization more broadly, but to the losers of the economic transition process, and say well, the transition to open market economies might have worked well for a subset of professionals who work in big cities, who speak English, who can travel abroad, who can borrow to buy apartments and cars and have a Western lifestyle. But it has not worked out so well for those who might be in rural regions, in poorer regions, regions that are now declining, or retired people. And so it's the winners and losers, the contest between the economic winners and losers of the post-communist transition that is framing the battle for the success of populism. And finally, there is a cultural variant of this winners and losers argument that looks at the post-communist transition as primarily sociocultural transition. And here we see a tale, a story about the culture war between national social conservatives and pro-European socially progressive liberals that are fighting for dominance, political dominance and electoral dominance in Eastern Europe. So it's these three types of explanations that we see in the broader literature on global populism, but then in the Eastern European context have specific version. So here, what I wanted to do to give you a flavor of how we understand voting preferences is share some of my own research. I'll go through it very quickly. When my collaborator and I looked at the demand side of the rise of populism in the region, the first thing we did is we went to the European Social Survey and we looked for questions that speak to the economic, ontological, and cultural insecurity. We identified those, we pulled the data. As you can see, for example, here, economic insecurity is how satisfied are you with the present state of the economy, of education and health services, should government reduce inequality, have you experienced unemployment, is your employment contract a good one or a junk contract, right? So all these are questions that give us a sense of perceived or objective loser of the transition. And we've done similar work for the other insecurities. And then our focus, we put the data on Hungary and Poland from 2004 to 2018. And the first analysis that we did is to pull of all that data. And you can imagine that we expect that someone who might feel economically insecure would give a similar answer to the questions that are in our economic insecurity cluster. And so we performed what's called a factor analysis to see how all the answers group together. And what we find out is very interesting, and some of it confirms our expectations, but some of it is quite interesting and new. And I will quickly go through it because it speaks to this question that I promised that we'll discuss about the relationship between populism, democracy, and authoritarianism. So when we do this factor analysis, what we see is that we have the first factor, which is broadly like the economic insecurity factor, because we have questions like satisfaction with public services, the state of economy. But in that cluster, we also see questions that have to do with the state of democracy, trust in parliament, and in European Parliament. And the reason why that makes sense is interesting is because it's not just about economic insecurity, and it's not just about personal economic insecurity. What you see instead is that the way voters have experienced the years between 2004 and 18 is that for them, they're thinking about the political economy of their country, not their own pocketbook, but their country is defining that experience. And it's political economy because, again, it's this transition from post-communism to market democracy. And we see questions both about market and democracy clustered together. And again, I want to emphasize again, this is about the country's performance. It's not about individual performance, right? Which is interesting. The second cluster is ontological insecurity. So those are the people who are tired of change and chaos, who want to know the social order, strict rules, who want to have steady and stable life. And then finally, we have a third cluster, which is similar to the cultural insecurity argument, but it's very post-communist in a certain way. Because here we see trust in the United Nations, European Parliament, but also in the country's parliament, rights for minorities like migrants and homosexuals. So again, this speaks to this international transition of both domestic and international opening, which, if you remember, is part of the post-communist transition. And so you see, to me, what's interesting and what I hope you'll pick up on and what we'll talk about in the Q&A is this relationship of how democracy features in support for populism, and how it's embedded with these other factors. Okay, so to further understand that, what we did next is we took how individuals answered these questions. We also took down the data for how they voted, right? Who they supported and whether they supported the populist party or not. And then we also collected some standard controls such as gender, age, education, religion, ethnicity of the voters. Those we tend to know matter when voting. But also there have been a number of arguments about these socio-demographic features mattering, right? You might hear people arguing, well, it's really the youth who vote for radical or populist parties, or, oh no, it's middle-aged men who vote for populists. Or it's really the religious, the conservatives who vote for populists, and so on and so forth. So we downloaded this data as well. And then we looked at how our factors account for support for populists. And the first thing that I want to point your attention to is that none of the controls really matter. They're not significant, which is somewhat surprising, but it's also consistent with the broader literature that doesn't find consistent patterns of socio-demographic voting for populist parties. And we find the same, right? But then we look at the three factors, and what we see is that when populists are in opposition, economic insecurity or the domestic transition really matters. And it's those who are dissatisfied with the domestic transition that tend to support populists. Similarly, but with much less impact, we see that those who are disgruntled with the international dictate on their countries also tend to be more populist. The next thing we did is we said, okay, so this might be what brings populists to power. Now let's see what keeps them in power. So we look at voter support for populists when those parties are incumbents. And again, we see very strong, significant results and support for the domestic transition. But now it's reversed. Now the voters believe that the domestic transition has finally gone well, and because of that, they're supporting these populists, right? So once they see the parties that represent them and their views in power, they feel strongly supportive that the transition is and will be going the right way, and they keep voting to keep them in power. And what's interesting is that now the cultural insecurity or the relationship between the country and abroad is not as important. But what begins to matter is the sense of stability, right? So populists manage to convince their voters that they have finally created security and stability for the nation and the people. And because of that, they should be kept in power, right? So to sum up, you can think about these three different types of insecurities, how they might change over time, what the continuity and what some of the changes. And in our particular research, we find that a rejection of the domestic transition, the economic and political domestic transition, propels populists in power. But then it turns into satisfaction that keeps them into power, with cultural insecurity sort of playing more of a role while those parties are in opposition, whereas ontological insecurity playing more of a role while those parties are in power. Okay, so let me stop here.